right, I think we are 1 minute past here, so we will go ahead and get started. I am not Catherine Smith, I am Will Farmer. I'm stepping in to host this session for you or moderate this session for you. So welcome again to the session on landscape level conservation. I again am Will Farmer. I'm the Deputy Director on the federal side of the Northeast CASC. I'm filling in for Catherine, who's the actual federal director. Today we have Carl St. John, who is one of our NECASC fellows, here to help us handle the session and manage the Q&A. So at this point, I'll just hand it over to him and let him introduce our speakers, and we'll sort of get going.
Great, thank you, Will. Like I said, my name is Carl St. John. I'm a fellow at NECASC and PhD student at Cornell University. Today, our first speaker will be Toni Lynn Morelli from USGS and also part of the NECASC. She'll be talking about climate change refugia conservation for the Northeastern United States. Toni, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Will. So I am going to kick off this session. We're going to have two talks about Refugia. So I'll just give some background on Refugia and some of the work we're doing in the region. Very excited to be here. I'm a research ecologist with the NECASC. Just give a couple of reminders that climate change is happening. This is a view from the latest National Climate Assessment, showing that temperatures are increasing in the Northeast more than in most places in the country. That's what the red is, and especially in winter, which is particularly interesting when we think about the Northeast. Winter is a particularly important part of our region and our region's climate, and we in fact are losing cold and snowy conditions. This is work from Alex Contosta, and Dr. Casey Thornberry was part of the author team on this recent, well, almost recent paper. And you can see that on the left, top left here, we have the number of snow cover days just going down in recent years, the number of bare ground days increasing. This is from the first half, essentially the first half of the century to the last 20 or 30 years, compared to the last 20 or 30 years. And you can see here in the Northeast that we have these big red circles. That means that we've had a big increase, a big decrease in snow covered days and a big increase in bare ground days. So just to kind of set the stage that we are seeing climate change, and that's affecting the ecosystems and species we care about. Here's just a few that you might be concerned about in the region, and thinking about amphibians and rare species like montane butterflies. The moose is a special conservation species of focus for us here, and people as well, thinking about the effects on humans, and then the ways we interact with the environment and appreciate sort of its ecosystem services and what it brings to us. So this all can be very depressing. I tried to put positive pictures, but of course, this is a slide about how all these things are going away. And so here comes climate change adaptation to help intercept these problems and solve all of ours. A quick background on thinking about climate change adaptation. This is work from the foundational work was done by Connie Millar in 2007 and has been continued on. There's also an updated framework that is coming out of the National Park Service, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, and they're all very closely related. This idea that there's three kind of buckets of ways that we can help our ecosystems and species adapt. One is to enable transition or direct change through promoting connectivity, diversifying seed sources, translocating. We can promote resilience to change, including thinning forests, or even thinking about like making snow at ski areas. And what we'll be talking about a lot here is creating resistance to change. So reducing fire breaks, reducing disturbances, creating fire breaks, intense removal of invasives or migrants even. this way that we'll be talking about resistance strat options in this hour is thinking about climate change refugia conservation. So this is just a cartoon view of how you might find refugia on the landscape. So you can see you might look at topographically complex terrain that might hold microclimates. You look in deep snowdrifts, you look at cold groundwater inputs to streams and lakes or deep lakes, look to canopy cover. This is sort of again, a cartoon version of where you might find this on the landscape. Before I go on, I just want to note that although we do think mostly about refugia conservation in terms of resistance strategies, there's ways in which it can actually, we can think about it in the context of other adaptation as well. So here's an example of that. We can think of a place that is, let's say, cold enough for moose to comfortably do their thing in the summer and the winter. But maybe one of these is going to warm less quickly than the other. And because it's refugial, because of these characteristics. And so for a while, it will maintain habitat for moose, whereas the other one will quickly lose, come out of the moose climate niche, but maybe be a niche for white-tailed deer, for example. But there are other species that might actually benefit from this place eventually, even if it gets to be too warm for the moose. We can think of in other places, maybe elk. Excuse me. And so we can think of this actually from a transitional perspective as well. We define climate change refugia as areas relatively buffered from contemporary climate change that enable the persistence of valued physical, ecological, and sociocultural resources. You can see here a conservation, the climate change refugia conservation cycle. So this is built off of modification of kind of the adaptive management cycle. So it should look familiar. You start off identifying what it is you care about. What are your objectives and your focal resources? Assess them for their vulnerability to climate change, maybe revise your conservation goals and objectives. And this is all done in a co-production framework. So managers and scientists together working on this, managers and researchers together working on this. Then maybe the researchers are focused on mapping these refugial areas for the particular resources or species that have been identified. And then there are other inputs from managers thinking about what would you then, what are the actions you would take in these places. So we're going to go through this cycle, showing you some examples of the work that's been happening in the Northeast. So long ago, in the world before a pandemic, indeed 5 years ago, at the first iteration of this meeting we're having right now, our first science symposium of the Northeast Cask, we sat in a room together, very different from this room, but maybe many of you were there. And we had a conversation about what resources would we like to have mapped, have refugia mapped for in the Northeast. And there's a word cloud there. You can see brook trout was definitely a priority, and there were others as well. And so we took that information and we digested it, and we moved forward with some of the research that we've been doing in the last 5 years based on those recommendations. This is a screenshot from the Refugia Research Coalition website. That's a collaboration across the continent of managers and researchers that are thinking about refugia. And you can see we have a page for the Northeast. You can see where we've kind of split up some buckets of things that came out of that meeting 5 years ago, including coldwater streams, because you saw brook trout really popped out there. Becca Quinones is going to speak in a few minutes, but also already talked to us this morning about the work that the Massachusetts is doing on brook trout refugia. And I just want to show a map of hers from her previous work, where the state was doing surveys, Mass Wildlife was doing surveys. So this is where, for example, brook trout are currently found in the blue dots. But if we then move the projections forward, and this is through collaboration with Ben Letcher, you can see that some of these stream reaches become uninhabitable for the brook trout. And that's in red. And as we move again to a future of 4-degree increase, we lose even more stream reaches. And finally, we end up at 6 degrees with much fewer places that we would think would be suitable for the brook trout. Although great work by Becca and collaborators looking at kind of the intricacies and like local scale data to say that maybe some brook trout can persist even in some of these places. Another perspective that they brought to this work, and this is published in the special issue I'll talk about throughout my talk, but it's cited at the bottom there, is thinking about networks of coldwater refuges. So this idea that some species need more than just, and in fact, most species need more than just isolated refugia. And this is something that Bill will talk about as well, thinking about the connectivity among refugia. This work is available, Coldwater Refugia mapped for the Northeast in the EcoSheds ICE portal. And I will come back to this because there's really great information here, but just to kind of show you that we have these data available for you to take a look at. So we had all these buckets set out for the Northeast, but if you're looking closely, you might have noticed this little image in the top right here. This is again from our website, climaterefugia.org, and we have actually dove deep working with the National Park Service on some of these ideas. So with my master student Sarah Wisner and postdoc Tina Mozelewski, both NE-CASC fellows, and in collaboration with Aaron Weed and Abe Miller-Rushing of National Park Service, we have been mapping climate change refugia for the National Park Service Northeast region. This work, again, was co-produced. It's a translational ecology approach where we all work together. Essentially the first day of the pandemic last year, March 16th, we all didn't take the plane we were planning on taking and instead went to a Zoom room and had our workshops. And we've held workshops throughout the last year and a half to produce, first of all, the kind of priorities that were identified by Park Service staff in the Northeast. You can see those in the bottom right. And then to actually map the things that were requested. So this is the process again. We went through workshopping, we went through these green circles, the researchers went off and did the mapping here. We'll talk about the other circles soon. Here's some examples of some of the results we have. So looking at, for example, white spruce on the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, and you can see how their biomass changes. This is work by Matthew Duvenek from 2010 to 2080, and then refugia are identified here in orange. That's known as, labeled here as sustained. So 46% of the white spruce habitat is expected to be remain in 2080. Balsam fir has a much better story with almost 83% of its habitat in that region expected to be refugia. If we zoom in on a smaller park unit, the Marsh Billings National Historic Park, you can see what that looks like. And when we really zoom in on the pixels, you can see that balsam fir is expected to be lost from some of it lost, and then a lot of new gain of balsam fir into 2080. Here's a view of Acadia National Park looking at paper birch, and again, looking at those refugia and also some new gain of paper birch. So we have these data available for all of the national park units in the Northeast region for all of these tree species and more. Bill will talk about this in just a minute, so I won't go into detail, but through the Designing Sustainable Landscapes project and Nature's Network, we have projected data for wildlife for the National Park Service as well. So for example, snowshoe hare, here are the refugia for them. We have them for common loon. This is the Northern Appalachian Trail. This is in Maine, Bicknell's thrush. This is Bicknell's thrush in New Hampshire. So we have all these data. I'm going to go quickly, but just to kind of whet your appetite of what we have available. And so for every national park unit, we have these tables that say not only kind of what is the refugia available, but also how it indicates kind of what is that park particularly important for, what's its significance across the region. Sarah Wisner, as part of her graduate work, also did new modeling for some of these species that were identified by the managers, including the black-throated green warbler. You can see refugia for that here in 2080. And zooming in on a park unit. For the marbled salamander, again, you can see that here for 2080 for RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And here's the broad view. So we can think about, okay, what do we do about this? So marbled salamander, well, they care about things including air temperature and precipitation, but they also care about habitat, specifically vernal pools. We've gone on to map vernal pool refugia for salamanders as well. This is a publication that just came out a couple months ago, led by Jen Cartwright. So she looked, thanks to Evan Grant's monitoring of refuges and some park units in the Northeast. We had data for when vernal pools dried up, and she modeled forward to see which ones seemed like they would stay wet long enough to support salamanders and frogs. So we have those data available also in this publication. So you can see then some of these vernal pools and which ones we think are projected to stay wet and which ones wouldn't. The important thing is, what do we do about all this? We've had then through all of these projects, we have discussions to say, okay, well, what would you do if you saw that there was a relationship between forest biomass and vernal pool wetness? So thinking about sort of management actions in this realm. Similarly, as I said, we have this great information about Coldwater refugia, including just particularly for the National Park Service. So you can choose a National Park Service unit on the left here and look at what will happen, what will the Coldwater refugia look like into the future with 2 degrees or 6 degrees if we focus in on marsh fillings, for example. So then, given that you know where the refugia are, you can look to some actions. What would you do? Floodplain and riparian restoration and enhancement, for example, nutrient management and other things. And so to come around the circle, we can think about, for example, a great example we have from working with Acadia National Park, where they identified what they wanted to see mapped for, and then they use that information, for example, to prioritize restoration and treatment of invasives in a particular parts of their unit. This work was covered in the New York Times recently. It's really exciting, thanks to Abe Miller-Rushing and his great collaboration on that. So great, lots more information, our special issue in Frontiers, and happy to take questions on this. And of course, Bill will be following up with more information on Refugia, so just check out our website, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Tony. That was a great presentation. We do have one question in the chat, which I'll say out loud while we're transitioning to the next speaker. So this question asks, could you describe the process of mapping in a little bit more detail? And so the attendee is interested in how do you measure density of biomass? How do you know what regions constitute refugia? They're just interested in the technical process for creating maps.
Okay, so in 30 seconds, I'll just say that I'm happy to share some references. I can put that in the chat once I'm done, but part of it is knowing what species need for the future or for their habitat and climate niche. And in fact, Bill will be talking about some of the technicalities of this as well. But so we can do species distribution modeling to figure out what temperature, what climate and environmental variables that they cue in on that predict the presence of, for example, an animal species or a plant species. And then we can roll the future forward to see where those conditions are going to be. And if they are in this, if a place contains those conditions in the future as well as in the current, then we can identify those as refugia. That's one example. I'll hand it over to Bill.
Great, thanks, Tony. So there are a couple more questions, and perhaps Tony can get to those as typed answers later. Our next speaker is Bill DeLuca. He's from the National Audubon Society, and today he'll be talking about the importance of landscape connectivity for climate refugia networks. Please go ahead, Bill.
Thanks. I just want to start by acknowledging the co-authors on all this work, Brad Compton, Joanna Grand, Scott Jackson, and Ethan Plunkett. Together, this group makes up the Designing Sustainable Landscapes Project, which has been a group that's been together since about 2010, working really closely with NECASC and the Northeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop landscape conservation design for the Northeast region. So as we just heard from Tony Lynn so eloquently, climate change refugia is a very common, effective strategy for thinking about conservation of wildlife populations given climate change. Tony Lynn did a great job of just kind of, one, defining it. I don't even need to explain this slide now. And two, just kind of talking about how some of these climate change refugia concepts can be applied across broad landscapes. Inherently, though, climate change refugia is a restricted version of a species' current distribution. So on the left, we're looking at the landscape capability of Blackburnian warbler from the Nature's Network products that the Designing Sustainable Landscape Project estimated. And on the right, we're looking at what the refugia for this species looks like. And the blue areas have high landscape capability or high refugia, and the yellow and red areas have lower refugia value. So in the future, we get this restricted, more isolated version of a species' current distribution. And of course that varies. Some species will become more fragmented and isolated and others less. And that's kind of the crux of what we're going to get at today. We also know that landscape connectivity in general is important for maintaining wildlife populations. Most of us have probably taken an Ecology 101 class where we talk about metapopulation dynamics and just the stressing the importance of species' ability to be able to move between habitat patches across a landscape. These are more movements like dispersal movements, migrational movements, and just movements that might occur over generations as we think about genetic flow across a landscape. What I'm talking about here and all of the kind of refugia considerations when we think about connectivity are really all these kind of generational broad scale movements. We're not really talking about within season movements. That's not what we're focusing on. It's not the daily kind of home range movements. It's more about those broad scale movements. So we know that in general, refugia networks will become more fragmented and less connected. And we also know that landscape connectivity is an essential component to healthy wildlife populations. However, despite the fact that climate change refugia has been a part of kind of our conservation toolbox for probably the better part of a decade, if not more, this idea of kind of assessing the connectivity across a landscape really just started popping up in the literature probably over the past couple of years. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So the objectives for this, what I'm going to talk to you today, are based on a project that was recently funded by NECASC. One of the things that we wanted to do was to estimate updated refugia networks for 10 species. The original Designing Sustainable Landscapes project for Nature's Network focused on 31 species. For this project, we're just focusing on 10. I'll get into how we selected those species in a minute. We also wanted to develop an approach that can assess the connectivity, the broad connectivity across the region for refugia networks that considers both local connectivity as well as connectivity at more broad regional scales. And then finally, we wanted to be able to identify those areas that are important for refugia networks that have high refugia value and high connectivity value. So the 10 species that were selected, we're looking at here. This was based off of a stakeholder-driven process where we polled stakeholders across the Northeast that reflected both federal agencies, state agencies, and NGOs. These are all species of conservation concern. You can see we have some diversity here, primarily birds, but we also have at least one mammal and a few turtles. And I just wanted to quickly define how we identify climate refugia. So this is our general species distribution modeling approach. We have a bunch of different flavors to get species distribution models for both current and future landscapes. The way we define refugia for this exercise is we operate under the assumption that essentially the habitat won't change between now and 2080. Most of the literature shows that habitat is relatively constant until about 100 years. So we felt like it was probably a safe bet to just keep habitat capability itself constant between now and 2080. But what we changed was climate suitability. So we have climate suitability for 2020, and then we have climate suitability for 2080. That's how we get our change between the current and future landscapes. I also wanted to note that our original version of this was based off of RCP 4.5 and 8.5. The stakeholders decided essentially to average across the two. Now, just over the past 10 years, we realized that RCP 8.5 is probably a more realistic view of what the climate conditions will look like in 2080. So all of our updated species distribution models reflect that change. As I had mentioned before, the original version of the Nature's Network products really were intended to focus on 2010 as the current landscape. And through recent work that was funded by Fish and Wildlife Service, we've updated both our climate models in collaboration with NECAS, as well as our land use models, so that now the products that we're generating reflect the 2020 landscape and climate, which was kind of one of those unfun things that we had to do, but was really important work, and it kind of built the foundation for us to be able to start to look at some of these more interesting questions. So here's an example of two species. This is the climate refugia networks for both wood turtle and Bicknell's thrush. For all of the species that I'm going to talk about today, we've done this for the entire Northeast. Obviously, some species like Bicknell's thrush are only found in the northern regions of the Northeast, but we ran all of this for the Northeast. When you zoom out at the Northeast, you can't always kind of see the spatial products. So most of what I'm going to show are zoomed in versions, but I just wanted everyone to remember that everything that we've done here is for the entire region. So on the left, if we look at wood turtle, you can see that the green areas are refugia, and you can see most of the areas that were modeled as habitat for them in the current time step remain as suitable. So most of their areas are green. They're identified as refugia. There's a few areas of expansion of areas that were gained based on climate change. In contrast, if you look at Bicknell's thrush, the majority of their current habitat was lost, and we really only have a small percentage of where they currently inhabit that were maintained as refugia. And so when we look at this kind of idea of how much habitat was lost across the 10 species, we see a wide variety of how much habitat was lost. So that's what we're looking at, the percent of the current habitat that will remain in the Northeast as refugia for each of the 10 species that we considered. And you can see for species like box turtle, moose, and to some extent wood turtle, a good proportion of their current habitat will remain as refugia. But if we look down on the right side for species like Bicknell's thrush, Blackburnian warbler, and American woodcock, based on our kind of relatively conservative definition that an area has to be maintained in terms of climate suitability as well as habitat suitability, those three species essentially don't have a refugia network in the Northeast come 2080. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the implications for that finding might be. But now I just want to move into how we looked at connectivity by refugia networks. I mean, some of this work was essentially just developing this approach. The other part of that is kind of understanding how we might interpret some of these findings to inform our conservation across broad spatial scale. So when we're thinking about local refugia connectivity, we employed a method called random low-cost paths. That was something that was developed by Kevin McGarrigle and Brad Compton primarily. Essentially, there are many randomized pathways that try and get from one refugia core area to another. The landscape itself provides some level of resistance, so it's kind of intelligent to the habitat preferences of a species. You can think about, for a wood turtle, it might kind of prefer to go through forests and riparian areas, maybe some fields, and avoid roads and urban development. And so what we get is kind of a gradient across the landscape in between the refugia patches of locations that are really important for connections among refugia cores compared to other areas that might be less important for refugia cores. And remember, each of these refugia cores themselves have a score based on how suitable they are retained in the future. It's not just binary, that each of them have a continuous score. The next thing we wanted to do was get a more regional assessment of connectivity. And for that, we employed a graph theory approach. One of the major constraints is just the computing power when you think about these broad spatial scales. And so one of the advantages of using graph theory is that it's really efficient and you can pretty easily incorporate large data sets. In general, the graph theory is an assessment of the importance of each one of our refugia cores across the landscape and understanding its importance for maintaining the general connected network across all of the Northeast. It identifies each one of our refugia core areas as a node, and then the edges are the connections between those nodes, and the edges are informed by that local connectivity that I just described, and the nodes are informed, the importance of the nodes are also informed by the refugia scores. So it's really just trying to understand how important is every single one of those nodes and edges in maintaining this broad network across the region. So there are several different indices that you can consider when we're thinking about regional connectivity based on graph theory. One is closeness, which is basically a measure of centrality. How central is any one of these nodes to the general network? Another is betweenness. So how well does one core connect to a few other cores in its local area? And then finally, strength. Are there several short connections to other cores? And so we were able to score each one of the refugia cores based on each of these three metrics. But it's kind of hard to decide which of the metrics are most important. So one of the things we wanted to do was develop a relatively comprehensive refugia score. So for each of the 10 species across the full Northeast, we developed a new comprehensive refugia score that incorporates the three regional connectivity metrics that I just described: closeness, betweenness, and strength. It also incorporates 2020 landscape capability, 2080 refugia values. And so now we can start to kind of have a more comprehensive view of what each of the importance for each of the refugia cores across the full network might be. When we wanted to kind of think about how connectivity for the refugia network changes between 2020 and 2080, this is a pretty simplistic way of thinking about it. But we have species like moose and box turtle and piping plover that have a relatively well-connected network in the current time step for 2020, because we also ran this for all of the for the 2020 landscape. And they essentially stay relatively well connected when we think about their refugia network in the future. But then for species like woodcock, thick-nosed thrush, cerulean warbler, and to some extent spotted turtle, their refugia network is much less connected than their current distribution across the landscape. And then we have species like wood turtle and salt marsh sparrow, which have relatively unconnected networks now, and they remain relatively unconnected network in the future. When we think about some of these species that have declining connectivity, those are species that we might want to focus on connectivity measures, some of those surfaces that we just looked at, as we're thinking about their conservation in the future given climate change. So to summarize, all of this was kind of considered in the regional landscape conservation design. It's meant to inform that design. I think that we've developed some spatial tools that are going to be helpful to assess both local and regional connectivity when we think about refugia networks. We've found that species respond differently to refugia networks. Their connectivity changes And we were able to kind of quantify that change over time. But we also found that several species have limited 2080 refugia networks. So the idea of refugia as a strategy for their conservation in the future might not be as effective. So given that rapid rate of change and the fact that that refugia network is very limited for some species, the next project that we're going to be working on is going to be focusing on this idea of regional ecosystem-based connectivity, not species-based connectivity. The idea here is that it'll complement refugia strategies, so it'll facilitate connectivity and provide guidance when there's limited refugia network for some of these species. It'll focus on regional connectivity, like I mentioned earlier, generational or genetic level connectivity. It'll be connections that are specific for ecosystems. It's not specific for any one species, nor is it specific for individual cores. And because it's specific for ecosystems and looks at the connections across the landscape for a specific ecosystem, it'll basically, the idea is that it'll benefit multiple species that are dependent on those ecosystems. And so this will be really informative for some of those species that we have, that refugia will be less informative for. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was great. You've got a couple questions in the question and answer. The first I'll go ahead and post is a question about how those refugian corridors are developed, and more specifically, do you know that the species are using those spaces, or are those spaces modeled based on climate and habitat requirements?
Yeah, so this was a model. We don't know for sure that any species is using some of these predicted connection locations of high connectivity. And this is essentially the method that we use to, at least for local connectivity, where we defined where and how a species might move between cores. So it's kind of, like I said, a randomized process where you kind of have several hundred simulated connections between two areas, and the landscape itself provides resistance. So as any modeled connection moves across the landscape, it tries to find both a short path and one that provides the least amount of resistance.
Awesome, thanks, Bill. There are a couple of other questions that Bill can probably get to in typed answers, and this will give us a little time to switch over to our next presenters. So next we have Rebecca Quinones and from Mass Wildlife, and Grace Dorenzo from USGS. They'll be talking about landscape scale conservation in aquatic ecosystems, successes in Massachusetts, and challenges with expanding to larger scales. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Carl. Grace, if we can go to the first slide. This project was really born out of a sense of urgency that some of us felt when looking at worldwide trends in aquatic biodiversity. And I should clarify that here we're really talking about freshwater biodiversity. We're not looking at marine systems or tidal systems. And this is a great graph that came out of a report from WWF in 2020, basically depicting that worldwide, from the 3,700 species that they were looking at and had enough data to analyze, they're finding that those species had average abundances that were decreasing about at a rate that led to an 84% drop in their abundances since 1970. So this is all pretty recent. So next slide. So fortunately in Massachusetts, we have had a lot of forethought and work going into how do we protect biodiversity. Starting at the upper right-hand corner, if you think about the way that we've approached our state wildlife action plans, talking about the different aquatic habitats that we work in and the things that we can do to protect them. We also have laws, very stringent laws, things like the Wetlands Protection Act. And very formally or very decidedly, we have this framework for protecting biodiversity that's referred to as biomap. We're in upgrading this biomap 2 that was done in 2010, all in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. We're in the process of updating that. But if you go to the next slide, something that's become very obvious is that these efforts to date have been fairly limited in scope in some ways. These have largely focused on single species conservation, largely focused on listed species or species of greatest conservation need. And that's due to the regular mandates that we have. Also, when we're thinking about how changing conditions are going to impact either habitats or species, we're usually talking about climate change conceptually. So applying principles in landscape ecology, for instance, protecting intact areas versus providing corridors between patches as a way to mitigate climate change, but not necessarily specifically using the climate change projections, for instance. One more slide, please. Also, none of these plans really look at the tools that we use for management concurrently with these kind of predictions that we're going to see as far as trends in development and trends associated with climate change. And so there is no way to really optimize where we should be doing specific actions in order to protect biodiversity. And largely because of our jurisdiction, we've been limited to considering just the largest scale as the state of in of itself. So next slide. In this project, what we're proposing to do is to build on that work that's already existing and ongoing and add consideration of things like common species so that we can build biodiversity metrics. Next slide. So that we're not only just considering single species, but also looking at assemblages and community structure. Next slide. We also want to add all of the great climate change research that has been going on with collaborators and the CASC system that would really help us fully understand in a more predictive way what's going to happen in the region. So next slide. And the reason we want to expand beyond our state borders is certainly because species and habitats don't adhere to those borders, but also because we want to try to understand how dispersal may, or the lack of dispersal, the inability to disperse may play a role in how we think about conservation. And one more slide. And so if you go to one more slide, Grace. This is just a list. I didn't mean for you guys to read this slide, but it's a list of all the research that any CASC has been doing that could actually benefit us, that we simply just don't have the capacity to, for instance, standardize the data sets or put them in the same scale that we use for projects. And so that's one of the main goals of this project, is to be able to capitalize on the research that's already existing. Next slide. As far as what taxa will be looking at to come up with these biodiversity indexes, we're really limited to where there's plenty of data. And we know that we have a decent record for fishes, for aquatic insects and freshwater mussels. We have considered adding things like aquatic plants, and we'll still be seeking more information that we can add in order to really look at ecosystems and community holistically. Next slide. And as far as the habitats evaluated, we're thinking of lentic and low-tick systems, so flowing waters, all the way from the headwaters to the main stems, and for lakes and ponds. And then just recently, there was this idea that we could use recent research that's been coming out on vernal pools to also try to encapsulate the information that's available there. So now I'll turn it over to Grace to talk a little bit about the logistics of the project.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. That was really great. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll go over our approach, project deliverables, and management implications. So in terms of the project timeline, this project will be conducted over 2 years, with one phase of the project occurring in each year. And we're excited to hire a new postdoc that'll be starting with us January 2022. And so during the first phase of the project, or the first year, we'll start off by compiling existing data on 2 things. The first of which is the climate and aquatic ecosystems data from the NP-Snowshoe products, which Becca was just mentioning a few slides ago. And the second thing we'll be doing is compiling aquatic biodiversity data from partnering states on the project. And so for this project, like Becca mentioned, we've created a partnership among 4 northeastern states, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, that have all agreed to share their aquatic biodiversity data. The aquatic biodiversity data that we collect from partners may be part of standardized surveys or opportunistic data. It might be single species, multi-species. The data might be detection, non-detection, abundance, biomass density. We're hoping to compile as much biodiversity data across this region as we can. And once that data are compiled, we will standardize and rescale the data as appropriate. And we'll talk to partners about how the data were collected, the purposes of data collection, as well as the structure of their data. And so in this way, we're hoping to gain the most utility of this great database and compilation that we're setting forth to do. During the first phase of the project, we'll also be convening monthly meetings among these partners where we plan to discuss a few things. So we'll talk about what biodiversity metrics to calculate. There's pros and cons to different metrics that you could use. And we'll also be talking about what the prioritization or optimization process should look like for site selection and management action. So in those discussions, we're hoping to get out what makes a high quality site high quality. Will it be high species richness? Are there going to be a lot of native species there, high abundance? Is it these metrics plus the climate profile of the site in 50 years? Essentially, we're hoping to get at how to prioritize land protection in the face of future climate change and what management actions should be taken to protect that land. So lastly, during the first phase, we'll also calculate the biodiversity metrics and produce present day maps with the aquatic biodiversity across this region. So there will likely be several maps with different biodiversity metrics. Then during the second phase of the project, we'll develop a statistical model to identify abiotic variables such as stream flow, temperature, land cover that influences biodiversity. And depending on the data, we might be able to use something as elegant as a multi-species occupancy model that accounts for imperfect detection. And we're hoping to use a Bayesian framework to incorporate prior information. But again, all of this depends on the quality and quantity of the data. Then once the model is constructed, we'll use something like a population viability analysis to determine 2 things. The first of which is how will different management scenarios impact future biodiversity conservation, and then how will different climate change scenarios impact future biodiversity. And of course, we'll also be looking at the interaction of these 2 variables of how do both different management scenarios and climate change impact future biodiversity. Then based on the results of the population viability analysis, as well as the discussions from partners, we're hoping to identify the quote unquote best sites and management actions to prioritize land protection as well as restoration. And so in terms of project deliverables, during the first phase, we're hoping to obviously deliver an aquatic biodiversity database for the 4 states that we're partnering with, as well as producing present day aquatic biodiversity maps. During the second phase of the project, we're hoping to deliver a predictive model that identifies important abiotic variables that predict aquatic biodiversity, future projections of aquatic biodiversity under different management and climate change scenarios for this region, as well as a process for and the identification of what the best sites and management actions are to protect in the face of climate change. And so in terms of management implications for this project, we're hoping that this project leads the way in terms of a way to more directly incorporate climate change effects directly into land protection and restoration. We're also really excited that our results will be scalable. So managers at different spatial scales like county, town, or city will be aided in the identification of areas to prioritize for climate adaptation. And we're also excited that since this project is taking on such a large geographic scope, it will help us understand ecosystem response across a range of conditions. And so this is one of the powerful things that we think will come out of compiling such a great data set across this region. And lastly, this data set and analysis will provide a measure of ecosystem health across this region, given the important role aquatic habitats play and their link to terrestrial ecosystems. So with that, we'd like to thank our partners and collaborators across the different agencies helping to make this work possible. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Grace and Rebecca. That was an awesome presentation and super exciting work. Are there any questions from maybe any of our panelists while we give folks time to think of a few? So I've got a question, and either for Rebecca or Grace. I work up in the Adirondacks, which in some ways I find similarities between there and the Northeast. And I couldn't help but notice you had a sucker picture on one of your slides, which is my study species. What is this database? So a lot of work focuses on brook trout, obviously, and we've seen that previously. Does this database incorporate, or are you going to make sure you're incorporating other non-game species, or see if you can account for biases when game species are reported more often than non-game species?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly one of the goals of the project, is that plants have been so focused on listed species or target species that we forget that there's a whole slew of other species that are living in these habitats. And so the picture of the long-nosed sucker that I had was really to pinpoint that, yeah, we do a lot of efforts on certain species because of regulatory mandates or because they're the target of management or indicator species, for instance. But we definitely want to include, the yellow perches and the pumpkin seeds and everything else that lives in our habitats. And of course, I'm talking very fish-centric because that's my background, but we would do the same for the aquatic insects and freshwater mussels.
Awesome, thanks so much. We have another question along those lines. Will you be, actually, let's see. How might this project help inform revision of the state wildlife action plans for participating states? So how does this research get applied?
Yep, so I can only speak to Massachusetts because I'm not familiar with kind of the information that will be integrated elsewhere. But I mentioned biomap, which is this kind of framework of land protection that we use in Massachusetts to designate lands for protection, and about 40% of the state has been designated. That information directly is fed into the swaps. So the idea that we can look at specific habitats and the different components within the swaps, looking at things like species or habitats and whatnots, would be directly fed. So it's kind of like a precursor, almost like a research question that then would be integrated into the broader management plans that we're working on.
Awesome, thank you. See, we have a question in the chat as well. Are any of your colleagues from other areas of the country looking at trying this approach? So
yes, we are hoping that we standardize our method. So I know Connecticut has their own method of prioritization, which is fine. We're not out to change anybody's kind of methods, but what we struggle with when we look at the region is that we collect data and analyze this in different ways, and so it's very hard to really understand trends across big scales. And so that is actually one of the goals. And in talking to the other states, that seemed like everybody was on board, understanding that if they're not adapting this analysis in of itself, it is kind of an additional analysis that may inform them on what the trends are multi-state levels rather than just within their states.
That's awesome. Yeah, we all know that animals are not confined to states. Andrew Rorba, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question? Can you unmute yourself? All right. In the meantime, I'll ask another question. So will you be able to include aquatic connectivity in these models?
We're hoping so, hoping to make it spatially explicit and include a number of habitat variables that might affect aquatic biodiversity. That's the intention, yeah.
Great. And then one more question, might be a quick one before we wrap up. So when will the final-ish work be made public?
I'll let you answer that, Grace.
So, we're taking on a new postdoc January 2022, and hopefully compiling the data set the first year and then working on the statistical model and the prioritization the following year. So I feel like earliest probably end of 2023, like at the earliest, but likely after that.
Great, thanks so much. Let's see. Looks like we've got one more question. We do have 3 more minutes, so let's keep going. Thanks for leaving so much time for questions, by the way. Can you offer any advice or experience working at the landscape scale with tribal nations and communities and hyper-local groups engaging in local conservation efforts alongside those larger state and federal regulatory agencies?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. So often what we find is that the data collection that is happening, I mentioned this already, it's not standardized. So if there is a way, regardless of whoever is doing the data collection, could be citizen groups, for instance, if there is a way to really come together to understand that this understanding of biodiversity in a holistic way would benefit from multiple data sets from different areas that are collected in similar ways, that are in similar timeframes, so that we can actually pull them together. And that's really just one of the largest challenges that we have, is in our ability to use the data that's already existing.
Great, thanks so much. I believe that just about does it for us. Will, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Excuse me. Thank you, Carl, so much for guiding us through, and thanks for all our panelists. Really interesting presentations. Really enjoy you being part of this session in the audience as well. I'm going to pop in the chat. There's a way to send us back some feedback on the science we're doing. So be sure to check that out. And if this session really piqued your interest, after the break, after the 15-minute break here at the top of the hour, we'll have a workshop on landscape level conservation design. There are also some other workshops going on that you could check out as well through the agenda, but be sure to check them out and participate. And again, thank you all panelists and audience for joining us.